welcome. Thank you all for joining us for today's event. It's the AAEA International Section panel discussion titled Navigating International Development Research in a Changing Funding Climate. My name is Alexis Villacis, and I will be moderating today's conversation. And on behalf of the International Section, I want to sincerely thank the AAEA Trust for supporting this event. And I also want to thank all of you for taking the time to participate in what I think it's an especially and timely event. It's also really important for the discussions going on in the field right now. So, over the past several years, many researchers working in international agricultural and development economics have experienced some substantial uncertainty and transition, right? So, we have seen changes in federal priorities. We have seen restructuring of foreign assistance programs, evolving language and expectations in funding solicitations, and increasing competition for both public and private research funding. At the same time, the demand for rigorous, policy-relevant international research has certainly not diminished. It has not stopped. If anything, the global challenges we study, like food insecurity, climate adaptation, migration, agricultural production, poverty reduction, and many more, have become even more and more present. So, for many scholars, especially graduate students, postdocs, also early career faculty, pretty much everybody, the current environment raises many difficult practical questions, including how do we sustain international research programs, given all these shifting funding landscapes? How do we diversify funding portfolios? How do we frame proposals strategically while also maintaining scholarly integrity? And also, how do we mentor the next generation of researchers through periods of uncertainty like this? So, the goal of today's panel is not to engage in a partisan discussion, but rather to provide constructive, experience-based guidance from scholars who have spent decades building, adapting, and sustaining influential international research programs across changing political and institutional contexts. So we are incredibly fortunate to have three distinguished panelists with us today. First, Professor William Masters from Tufts University. He's internationally recognized for his work in agricultural economics, nutrition, food systems, and development policy, as well as extensive engagement with multilateral institutions and international research networks. Second, we'll have Professor Chris Barrett from Cornell University, whose work has shaped global conversations around food security, resilience, agricultural development, and international policy engagement. And third, we have Professor Ann Fitzpatrick from The Ohio State University, whose work on development economics, migration, labor markets, and so forth bring very rigorous empirical insights and important perspectives on the evolving international research landscape. Again, thank you all for being here. Our format today will be pretty much straightforward. We will begin with reflections from each panelist. This will be followed by a moderated discussion among the panelists, and then we will conclude with the audience Q&A. So for audience members here, please feel free to place your questions in the chat throughout the session, and we will do our best to address all of them or as many as possible during the Q&A portion. And with that being said, let's begin. Will, I would like to start with you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Alexis. Int'l and the others organized this. I think it's a really great use of the section. I hope to see many of you in Kansas City. The in-person annual meetings are important, but this is also a conversation that we can do online. And I expect many of you, won't be able to be in Kansas City, so it's just really nice that you could join, and that Alexis, Priya, and the others who organized this could have this chance to talk about these issues. So. I think we have a really good sequence. We were able to chat a bit among the three discussion openers, where the notes I'll share come from this agenda around food economics, the open access textbook that I hope is useful for you in teaching and to some degree in research as well, where clearly the context is for anyone with a recent memory window. The total amount of funding you can see on the vertical axis here going to through the Development Assistance Committee of the OECD, whether that's official development assistance or other official flows or private aid, rose quite sharply after COVID and is now plummeting. This is the level of disbursements from the US here and worldwide. The OECD's data here are poorly visualized. This is a low of 25,000. So you can see it's more than halving for the US and a very large decline worldwide. But this is especially severe in the low-income countries where people on this call are working, and that's because of the added funding for Ukraine and other not low-income, low and middle-income, or even upper-middle-income countries. But this, as Chris will mention, is after more than 2 decades of sustained increase in that total aid, where what I'm showing you here is, I'm sharing the combined slides, and so you're not seeing this, the labels, unfortunately. I won't switch to the labeled slides, but I'll share the labeled slides. Blue here is the total amount of official development assistance on the left axis. The yellow here is total humanitarian assistance, with the purple being food aid that's for development purposes, the green being agriculture, and the red being health. So again, my apologies for having switched the slides here. The labels are missing now. This is total on the left axis for total official development assistance. This in yellow is total humanitarian assistance on the right axis, total health on the right axis, total agriculture and forestry on the right axis, and total development food aid on the right axis. So, oh shoot, we also lost the build here. So first of all, this spike in total assistance is the structural adjustment programs of the 1980s that responded to the rise in private debt that countries had obtained in the 1970s during the commodities boom. In order to pay that back, there was this spike in aid. So just in terms of like my perspective, I was born in 61, the same year as the Peace Corps. I grew up in the 1970s when the United States was in far worse crisis in civil society than it is today. Our government was not as bad as it is today, but our civil society was much worse. We had the energy crisis, we had urban riots. My first experience of life in America was of this. We had international terrorism, we had famine in both South Asia and in Africa. I finished my bachelor's degree in '84, wanting to work on global poverty, and finished my PhD working on agricultural economics in 1991, which is here in the data. And you see that's during this period of plummeting aid to agriculture after the structural adjustment lending into agriculture that happened in the early 80s. So my entire first decade of professional life was in a year by year by year by year decline in agricultural funding. I experienced that every year of my early research. Less and less, all of the work was about how to do more with less because of the declining total investment in agriculture after it had peaked in the structural adjustment period. I switched to nutrition in the late 90s, not primarily because of declining funding, but because of the increasing prevalence of diet-related diseases, as it seemed like people were not getting their money's worth, and I was able to move to nutrition. So my perspective comes from that long-run history. And we're going to, spend the rest of the time talking about advice, but honestly, just experience, and just remember, every time you're hearing from someone else, there's bias, so forth. My life is very different from yours. I may misunderstand my own experience, and I see new kinds of information. So it might be true that this time is different, but honestly, maybe it isn't. Like, it could be true that this time is different because institutions have a lifestyle. Maybe our institutions are old that need to be changed. But I think it's clear that underlying mechanisms remain the same throughout the world, even as we call things changes and how we organize things changes, how workforce and constituents change very slowly. You can change top very fast, and you can destroy something like USDA quite quickly. But those people then move to other organizations and do other things. So really, the past is the only information we have. So we have to do our best to interpret it wisely. So if you're curious about my own story, it's told pretty well, I think, in this A&H Academy career journey. I also gave a farewell talk at Purdue that's described here. You can look at those if you're interested. So broadly speaking, my takeaways are, first of all, when bad things happen, it's important to grieve. It's important to recognize what was lost, and it's important to rebuild. I think everyone has that experience in their own families with the loss of loved ones, and the loss of institutions and jobs and all sorts of things. That ultimately, we know that technology is sort of this long-term underlying driver of whether you as an individual can succeed, and whether organizations and populations can improve well-being. So, the number one thing is just experiment with software tools, right? We're in an era of just unprecedented speed of software tool development. So you can take time off and just like focus on learning whatever new software tool is appealing. And the key thing is to not just be an ace at Python or whatever, but think about the complements to AI, right? Other people are going to be really good at Python. It can be helpful if you're just good at other people. And by good at other people, I mean know what they want. Have enough conversations with people so that you know what a likely referee cares about. The term we're using for this nowadays is taste. Do you have good taste? This is a very old-fashioned idea, but it's coming back with a vengeance to mean, can you see what is slop? What looks superficially good, but is just AI slop? And do you have judgment? Do you know the theory, the mechanistic explanation for things that would tell you that this is real versus a hallucination? So that is my number one sort of advice about using AI is build your people skills to predict what referees and editors care about, to predict what decision makers in government are likely to think. That's a matter of cultural attunement. Whatever culture you're from originally, you can become highly attuned to what other people want in the new environment. And often it's the newcomers who are most, who have the best taste in the sense of being culturally attuned to what's needed. Another bit of advice is don't overreact, because news and social media, makes bad and distant things seem big and close, and they are not big and close. They're happening somewhere else. Often they're actually small. It's your own circumstances that drive what you should do, and your own portfolio might change slowly, as we'll talk about today. So in my own situation, what I would say is the number one thing is try to get rid of the abstract constructs that we talked about in the past. If you find yourself typing the word systemic, backspace, 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 and replace it with something concrete. And the goal is to be relevant to people's lives. This gets to taste and judgment. Is it a real thing, or is it something that exists only in seminar rooms? The next point is do something that others don't. Being a generalist who does everything means you can do nothing better than others, and you do want to invest in depth. And the third and last point is, if you possibly can, be clear about how what you do might improve life for everyone. Because if we focus on distributional goals, we are setting up zero-sum conflicts. And we will lose those zero-sum conflicts to more powerful people. So think very carefully before you set up a goal as distributional when you might be able to produce improvements for everyone. So that's all I have as introduction. Key point is different people have different ideas. I'm really keen to hear from the others.
Thank
And from
you.
you.
Thank you. Thank you, Will. Next, we will have Chris.
Great. Thanks so much, Alexis, for setting this up and for inviting my participation. And it's always a pleasure to be on a panel with people like Will and Ann. I'm going to try to build on some of the wisdom Will's just shared with you, reinforce a few of his points, and perhaps offer you a few additional insights. one or two of which I hope might be useful. The key here to me is thinking about what some people refer to as the New World Order means for international development research. And let me just flag what I see as the big changes that matter. First, as Will documented quite nicely, there's been a sharp contraction in ODA. There are lots of issues about how ODA accounting is done, but it's clearly very strongly positively correlated with the funding available for international development research. But keep in mind the big picture here, as Will also showed you, although we see the sharp decline in the last few years, this is still the abundance of resources available for international development research is really striking to those of us old enough to remember the prior millennium or even the 2000 aughts. We really do still have a fair amount of resources, but there are also much greater restrictions on what you can do with that, especially coming from the United States. So yes, there's less plenitude than there was just a couple of years ago, but let's not overstate the severity of the loss of resources. The restrictions on public research funding, I think, may ultimately wind up being the more important things for us, constraining what we can do. But the other major feature is back in the 1990s when Will and I were cutting our teeth, there were far fewer people doing development economics research. I mean, agricultural economics programs really were the center of mass, but today all major economics and public policy programs host significant international development research programs. So while there are more resources available on the supply side, there's also a lot more researcher demand side for those same resources. So the competition is probably every bit as intense, maybe more intense than it was before, chasing more resources. But the competition also translates into much greater selectivity in getting into prominent journals. And so the heat that graduate students and postdocs and early career faculty feel, I think really stems primarily from this, that especially those seeking tenure track positions and ultimately tenured positions, the reality is publication in prominent journals remains the primary currency, and the evidentiary standards for research have only grown, which means that it's that much more important to get funding in an increasingly competitive space. And I think this is what has people stressed. It's not that we lost resources compared to 2 years ago. It's that just the bar is that much higher for those of you who are much younger than I am. Two other things that are really important, though, are one, the push towards localization. USAID was doing this fairly aggressively before its demise. I would argue this is long overdue, rooting more research on the global South, in the global South, led by scholars who have a deep understanding of, ideally, who are based in the locations that they're researching. But that means that prioritizing locally related research creates some added competition for and lessen demand for those of us sitting in North American or European institutions. And finally, we have to confront that there's just increasingly broad-based distrust of science and of scientists. And that goes hand in hand with the cuts in funding and the greater restrictions on funding. So we can decry this. We can say that this is kind of a horrible state of affairs, but it's reality. We just have to work with it. So what are the implications of these four things? The main thing that I want to impress upon people, I think echoing a point Will was making, is each of us needs to play to our comparative advantage. As a field, I think agricultural economics has a tremendous comparative advantage in our deep multidisciplinarity. I mean, agricultural economists routinely work with natural scientists. We have long ago gotten beyond disciplinary boundaries, and that frankly plays well. Likewise, it's a deeply empirical field at a time when pure theory is of increasing disinterest to funders and the public at large. And we've historically been very committed to research for impact. So that plays. Don't shy away from declaring your association with an agricultural economics unit if that's where you are. But as individuals, the key is reflect on what are your relative strengths. Is it your contextual knowledge? You grew up in a setting that is of interest to particular funders, so you have a deep understanding and rich contacts there. Is it your technical toolkit? You can just do things that especially old guys like me can't do. Is it you have this deep passion about some issue, maybe born of your personal experiences? Whatever it is, play that up and pursue that because there are an awful lot of researchers out there chasing the same dollars who don't have your relative strength. If you build a reputation for your comparative advantage, other people come calling. Many of the projects I'm involved in, I was invited into. I didn't initially conceptualize the core idea. I may have conceptualized things that followed, but somebody else invited me to participate because they saw a kindred spirit who had some skills that would be of value to them in their pursuit. And I like to synthesize this in the powerful Japanese concept of ikigai, the idea pursue the things that are at the intersection of what you love, what the world needs, what you're good at, and what you can be paid for. So think about what you're good at and what you love. Those doing international development research, I think, easily fit within that what the world needs. But finding that ikigai is really a key for each of us. The second implication beyond think of your comparative advantage of your ikigai is portfolio diversification. Those who had all of their research funding in one bucket, especially a bucket labeled USAID, suffered much more 15 months ago than the rest of us. So what do you learn from that? Within your topic or place of comparative advantage, build a portfolio of partners and funders. And this is a cushion against disruption. I've been involved for several years in multidisciplinary work in Senegal, and we've built this up. We started with a modest size grant from NIH, led by a collaborator who came to me, picking up on point from the prior slide. Our preliminary results there, we could turn into some funding from NSF's biology programs. We then leveraged that to get some money from the NSF social science behavioral and economic sciences program, some money from a foundation in Europe. We've coupled that with some small university grants. We build each of these one on the other, and that's allowed us to sustain shocks to the program pretty easily. And what is a small grant at the top of this becomes the foundation, the base for a follow-on project. So try to consciously think of a stepwise progression in how you're going to build up a portfolio of support for a program. There's a common core to all of this around reducing infectious disease exposure and boosting agricultural productivity in northern Senegal, but we represent different parts of this. We emphasize different features, different interventions, different hypotheses to different funders, and can build the portfolio that way. The third implication is that relationships really are key here. Especially with localization, it's all the more important to find the right local partners, build those relationships, which also means that we have to check our egos at the door a bit. It is often true that Northern universities, we craft the research agenda and then we go looking for partners in the field who are willing to support our research agenda. Be open to flipping the script. Ask your partners, what are their priorities and what help do they need? Serve as tech support rather than being the star. That's often a way to really get into some very interesting research that we might overlook that is terribly important locally, and just accepting the reality that localization is probably irreversible and desirable. Relationships aren't just with your prospective collaborators, it's also with operational agencies. And here, there's a massive untapped source of data. As money for data collection or running experiments has grown increasingly scarce and competitive, there's a treasure trove of administrative data available in many administrative agencies. And this comes to Will's point about making sure everybody can benefit. These administrative data are an underused resource, but they're not there to just be your data lackeys. They have missions, they have things to do. You have to offer a value proposition to an operational agency. What is it you can do for them that will boost their performance, that will help them in attending to their missions? And in so doing, are there interesting research questions you can access? In my experience, take the time to build these relationships, and you suddenly have access to extremely rich data sources that can dramatically reduce the cost of your research. Program officers at foundations and aid agencies are important, They feel the stress every bit as much as you do. Attend events that they go to, ask them questions. They want to identify grantees, and in particular, grantees who get the vision of their organization or themselves, and they want to understand where the research is heading. I just hosted an event here at Cornell earlier this month where we had multiple foundation reps, and they were there because they really wanted to hear where is the cutting edge research frontier, what is and is not feasible. And they don't want to waste time reviewing proposals that are going to be dead on arrival. They don't want to waste your time. They definitely don't want to waste their and their reviewers and their panel's time. So talk with program officers, build a relationship with them. The fourth implication is trust is important, both among your partners, especially local partners who unfortunately have reason to believe we in the North will be extractive, as well as with the public at large. So you really have to focus much more than we traditionally have especially in graduate curricula, on ethical concerns and political realities. Work I'm doing right now with a government of Kenya agency, they have very serious political constraints on what they can do. That effectively means they can't run an RCT on the programs they administer. So do we throw up our hands and walk away and say, you're not serious about science? Of course not. We figure out ways to be able to do rigorous impact evaluation of their work to give them ammunition to be able to go back to the Ministry of Finance to get more money to reinforce what seems like a good program. But we have to do this in ways that are both ethical and attend to their political realities. For those of us who run interventions, please keep in mind that IRBs and IACUCs are a really low bar to clear. I too often hear researchers talking about them as if they are these serious obstacles. They're bureaucratic, but they are a necessary bureaucracy to slow us down and make a third party think through what we're doing and if it's okay. There are an awful lot of studies that clear IRB approval that are deeply problematic. And we need to do a better job both teaching grad students and postdocs, as well as editors and reviewers policing research designs or data collection practices that seem to run roughshod over some fairly basic research ethics principles. Reproducibility and replicability is widely discussed. It's increasingly good practice, but still far from universal. One of the most common things I used to write to authors when I was editor-in-chief of food policy was, I couldn't possibly replicate your results in reading your paper and your supplemental materials. This is really interesting, but if I couldn't reproduce them because you haven't told me how you construct your variables, exactly what your estimator does, et cetera, what your data source is, then sorry, but this doesn't meet basic transparency standards. Those are fixable problems, to be clear. I never rejected people for that reason, but we should not be publishing things that can't be, at a minimum, replicated by others using this exact same methods. Finally, leverage secondary data. The world is awash in data right now. Money for experiments is increasingly scarce, so focus on what's more plentiful. There are enormous amounts of remotely sensed data, call records, census data, all administrative data from various agencies. We have lots and lots of data that goes unused. The relative marginal value of another RCT is falling, especially an RCT on things where we already have a fair amount of evidence. It's not that RCTs aren't valuable, but compared to 20 years ago when they were fairly novel, the marginal return is lower. There are a lot of alternatives out there. There are huge numbers of questions that are purely descriptive or predictive in nature that we can answer using secondary data, especially data fusion, combining data sources in creative and novel ways. We can't do inferential work quite as well because clean causal identification from observational secondary data is typically hard unless you can figure out a policy experiment or an instrument that really works. But there are important descriptive and predictive questions out there that can be answered. There's lots of meta-analysis to be done. We still, as a discipline, rely too much on invoking the best published single paper's results rather than synthesizing the results of a range of studies around an issue. And comparative methods assessments are very important. Thinking about the same data set multiple methods, especially for latent variables, for concepts that can't be directly measured, things like poverty, things like food security, resilience. These are not intrinsically directly measurable. We have lots of different methods to try to get at those concepts. Apply multiple methods to the same data set so we can understand what their differences are, what their strengths and weaknesses are. Those are very publishable topics that don't require you to raise a ton of money for a big RCT. Good journals publish these when done carefully. I just accepted a paper in the PNAS last night that was a purely descriptive piece using really creative data fusion on an important question that we just don't know much about that will interest multiple disciplines. So the claim that you can't publish anything without clean causal identification is just demonstrably false. So just do the work well, answer important questions, use high quality data and good methods. Changes come fast, that's undeniable, and it's okay to grieve and even to gripe. This has been a shock for many of us, but we've got to adapt. There isn't going to be a big reversal here anytime soon. So we have to adjust to a world in which there's more competition, fewer resources than there were a few years ago, but still lots more than there were a few decades ago. And above all, this is a very talented group on this webinar. Figure out what your talents are and double down on your ikigai, and your research can and will flourish. So don't despair. Thanks. I'll turn it over to Anne now.
Hi, thanks so much. Let me share my screen. Okay, please let me know if I am showing the wrong. Okay, assuming I'm okay. So, who I am, I'm a development economist. I am affiliated with JPAL and IPA. I'm also a placement coordinator. So I'm always thinking about grad students and more generally people who want to get a new job. I work around the world. I work in Ghana, India, Kenya, and Uganda. And kind of the theme is kind of health and development contexts, such as education, health, gender, things like this. I typically have focused my research agenda on RCTs because I think that's the coolest thing around. And I apply for a lot of grants. I have not had actually a lot of success with public funding, even in the before period, but I did have two major grants canceled. So I echo that this has been a hard time. So what I'm seeing is kind of related to the empirical findings, especially that Will highlighted, that there's fewer funding sources. On the flip side, everybody knows that. And so grant expectations, especially for your initial units, are going down. If you were in a grant-funded institution, such as IFPRI or Mathematica, that's extremely stressful for you, and I want to acknowledge that. If you're in academia, I do want to say everybody knows that this has been tough. There's also more increasing restrictions on PI time and allocations to US-based researchers, more generally high-income researchers. Universities are having a hard time, and major departments are not even admitting students at all. Some have just restricted the number of cohort. And so I think one thing to think about is things may seem stressful for you, but there are a lot of people who will not even have the opportunity to pursue graduate funding as a result of what happens. I'm also seeing a lot of differences in terms of placements. There's an increasing emphasis on postdocs and fewer AP positions, and people tend to be finding great jobs more internationally. And I think that's potentially different than some people were expecting. On the other hand, uh, the people that I know that have gotten jobs from our department are still pretty pleased, and they are going to do great work, and they're doing great things. I want to highlight the kind of similar to what the other presenters have said is that some things do seem to stay the same. Grants have always been competitive, and that you still need to always consider about what your research topic is, who the team is that you're proposing the grant with. Networks are incredibly important for grant writing. Publishing has always been very challenging. Uh, the line I like to say is each paper is a minor miracle. Like completing anything is pretty astounding. No matter if the team is big or just you, either way, it's hard. And also, I was a grad student once. I've been doing this for a while. People have always been stressed, and I'm not even sure the stress level is different because of things I don't want to tell in a recorded lecture right now. Um, People have, grad students in economics have reported higher depressed rates than incarcerated populations, and that was back in 2010. So I want to acknowledge that um, this is a tough, if you're a grad student, this is a very difficult thing that you are doing. There are many reasons why it's stressful. People have worked hard to reduce the stress and make the whole experience of graduate school better. Um, Assistant professors have consistently always been stressed, and tenure professors they're always grumpy. So some things never change. So one thing I am worried about is I do actually see that just anecdotal evidence that the well-being does seem to be going down. A lot of NGOs abroad have lost funding. This has caused both direct and indirect losses. There's a recent paper that came out about how conflict is increasing as a result of the aid cuts. We are all very keen on the fuel price surges, and that has had dramatic effects for people worldwide. I more generally worry about the loss of technical expertise as there have been mass layoffs in aid, in the aid sector more generally. And I also more generally worry about the assault on higher education. So I worry about people self-censoring their research agenda and generally less government. I do want to really highlight, though, that especially the top two bullet points highlight there's a really pressing need to do research. And that will mean that whatever you supply, there is the demand for it. Um, and so just to highlight that. And it may change, however, the type of research that gets funded. I'm having issues with moving forward. So what I would highlight what I'm doing and what maybe you can think about doing is focus on what you can control. And what you can control is going to vary by where you are in your career and what your specific research focus is and what your job is. Related to the other two cons as well, skills are generally always valued in the labor market, no matter what labor market you're in. Work on creating a toolbox that allows you to produce research, and that includes using AI effectively. As funding goes down to hire people, have been very remarkable improvements in how to use AI. Now, if that's not going to be equitable, it's still expensive. But I just wanted to highlight that there can be potentially a higher return to certain types of skills, although, of course, there's going to be costs as well. There's also a return to effort. Giving up is, I don't think, a great strategy. There's going to be returns to effort. So, what you possibly need to do is think about how you're directing your effort. So, celebrate the inputs and the outputs, but remember that, the outputs, in fact, are what matter. So, you can't get a grant unless you submit it. You can't get a publication unless you actually submit the paper. On the other hand, right, you need to maybe be more realistic about the chances and potentially allocate where you're spending your time in response to that. It doesn't spend sense to spend 6 months applying for one grant um, at the expense as well of potentially trying to submit a paper. And for the grad students, obsessively reading about how bad the job market is not a good use of time. And that kind of also goes more generally towards assistant professors or tenured professors. There's only so much of stress about things you can't control that's constructive. It's good to be an informed citizen. It's good to do what you want. But at the same time, once you have the requisite information, it's possibly better to get off of social media and do work. So, utility is not the same as happiness, but I would say keep following what you want to do, right? So for me, I'm motivated by the fact that the world is unequal and there's not a unique way to forward that goal and try to do something productive for the world. Similar to what Will said, what should you do? Well, especially for the parents and the audience, we can look to Frozen and we can just do the next right thing, right? In times of uncertainty, what you do is just the next step of what makes sense for you at that time. I think it's really important to acknowledge constraints, and that's a whole bunch of different grab bag of things. So there's personal constraints, such as you have a partner, there are visa restrictions on where you can work. There's institutional constraints, how high your teaching load is, more generally what your work duty is. And I think it's important to really do some introspection about what really matters to you and what you actually need to succeed. Not all effort is equally valued. It may be personal constraints are what you have. Maybe it's okay to spend a bit more time with your family and recharge rather than, spending a holiday with your papers. And I also want to highlight that there's been, in my experience, I keep saying this, but there's never an easy paper. Um, and I have never once in my career have an open RFP that's not incredibly competitive. It's even more competitive now, but it's always been competitive. So just keep that in mind that just doing something quick and easy is probably not going to turn out that way and may not be worth investing in more generally. And more in relation to that, you need to balance ambition with the facts. There was a movement a few years ago for people to write the CV of their failures, of the things that they've tried and not succeeded at. Because when you look at somebody's CV, you typically only see their successes. And if you wanted to know mine, it's that the vast majority of submissions that I do for anything are rejected. And you have to acknowledge that, especially depending upon where you are in your career or what institution you're at, some people have a lot more resources than you. So, as context, I have heard of people that have a full-time person writing grants for them. That's a lot of support. There are people that have lower teaching loads. So remember that comparisons that leave a joy, and people tend to only look up the social hierarchy. They never look at how successful they currently are. They only worry about how to get to the next step. And we should celebrate and try to appreciate um, uh, uh, our things just so we can make sure that we have a full overall life. And also remember, the motivation for why many of us want to do international development work, it applies to us as well. The world isn't equal, right? Grants don't always go to the best idea, I think. The best papers are not always the ones that are published. And so because we are typically motivated by the fact that the world is unequal, we should just be cognizant of the fact that we are going to experience inequality too. And it doesn't necessarily mean something about how, good you are or how smart you are. There's a lot of luck in the process. And the only way to combat bad luck is just to keep working harder, I think. And so if I had to give like concrete advice, I would say look for calls and work to build your network. So foundations are still supporting substantial work. I've seen calls recently for ag, health, displaced persons. There's a lot of research that people want to do on AI. The new Div just launched an open call. Um, I personally am only trying to apply for calls where the work is extremely closely aligned to what I already want to do. There are also FID, FCDO, JICA, NORAD. Those are other major government funders around the world. You typically need to have a local collaborator from one of those countries. So, one thing that, for example, AEA could possibly do is try to fund more people from those countries to come to the meetings. A lot of these groups, so for example, FID has a preference for countries. Um, JICA has similar preferences from what I understand as well. And most of these also take a premium on having a local collaborator reinforcing what Chris said is that actually has been overdue. I acknowledge that local researchers in the countries that are studied are often very underrepresented, and that is something that hopefully can be better. More generally, there's lists of funding opportunities. I personally have gone to major foundation web pages. I'm on funding emails, and I also check the acknowledgments of published papers of where they have received money. The last thing I want to say is, with change can come opportunity, and this can be an opportunity to build back better. So and even in the before era, I felt it was important to keep learning new skills. You can't be a rusty, sunken ship. Flexibility is a great strategy in research, especially if you are having a series of bad luck getting funding, for example, published. That might be a good opportunity to beef up the published paper part of your CV, which actually will make it easier to get funding. And also highlighting that the world is getting more and more technical. I see more data created. There's more administrative data to analyze, and increasingly funding requires posting existing projects data. So that is a very open opportunity to do really good work that's necessary. And finally, just to reemphasize, even with AI, the world needs smart, careful people who care and people who understand statistics, economics, agriculture, more general human behavior will always be in demand. And I'm going to end there.
Awesome. Thank you, Will. Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Chris, for all those thoughtful reflections. And I think one thing that already comes through clearly is that while the current environment presents real challenges, it is also forcing us and many researchers and institutions to think more strategically, right? And also creatively about how international development research is conducted, funded, and also sustained. So for the next portion of this seminar, I'd like to move into more of a conversational discussion across several themes that I know are on many people's minds, particularly around adaptation, funding strategy, mentorship, and the future direction of the field. So we will also spend some time thinking about where the field itself may be headed over the next several years and where new opportunities may emerge. So with that, let me start the first set of questions around the topic of pivoting or walking away. Many researchers are trying to salvage, of course, disrupted or canceled projects. That has happened to a lot of us. So two questions that I have around this topic that I want their panelists' insights are: when does it make sense to adapt and or repackage an existing project versus just cut the losses and move on? And related to this, what signals do you look for when you make that call?
Do you want just to go in sequence?
I mean, we don't have to follow any order, but yeah, feel free to do it.
Yeah, I mean, I would add, first of all, I would add a third category, which is shelving projects, just setting them aside, letting them mature a little bit. And the main signal that I use is just others' enthusiasm. If others don't respond enthusiastically, I'm like, this is just my own idea, like, I'll shelve it for now. And sometimes shelved ideas come back and sometimes they don't.
Yeah, I guess I would jump in that I have done each of the above. Shelve, pivot, and it just depends enormously on why you're feeling the constraint. Is it a sharp drop in budget where you don't think you could actually do the work you promised and do it well? In which case, punt. By all means, first attend to the quality of the work. Which I also acknowledge is a lot easier for those of us who have 9 months of salary paid for by a university to say than those who are in places where you got to raise all your salary. But it's almost always a long run bad deal to take a sharply reduced budget where you think you're going to have to cut corners and do work you wouldn't be proud of. But in my experience, most of the projects where somebody wanted to put important constraints, budgetary or otherwise, it was just put a pin in it and put it back on the shelf until either I can renegotiate with them or somebody else comes around who wants to do the full thing the right way.
Yeah, I think it's really a case by case study. I've also done all three. I feel like personally, I don't quit projects enough. And I think that I know of an unnamed, very top researcher who has an extremely impressive CV. That's really only possible, in my opinion, if you walk away from projects regularly, right? If you see how well the project's going to develop, and then you have the luxury of walking away. I have never felt secure enough to say, oh, I've invested, 5, 6 months. It's not going to be a top journal, so I can just walk away. I've never felt that security, but other people do. And again, this is what I'm saying is comparison's a thief of joy. You really have to make your own decisions about where your time, which is extremely valuable, is well spent. I have for the canceled USAID projects, I'm extremely grateful for funders. There was a lot of emergency funding that came back to help people that were in that situation. They did not help everybody. Um, and I'm extremely sad for people I've talked to that have lost extreme amounts of time in their life, and for NGOs that have closed. So I do want to acknowledge that I feel like I have been lucky, but some people have not been able to salvage um, their canceled projects, and labs will close. And Michigan State had a whole bunch of layoffs, and I really want to say I am so sorry to everybody affected. Same thing in the Mathematicas and the FPREs of the world. Your work is valued by many, and that's an injustice. Um, as far as what to do if you have the capacity to, I would say it partly depends upon sunk costs and opportunity costs. So they are extremely difficult to ignore sunk costs when you have invested a lot, but proper economic decision making means you have to take the no matter what has happened in the past, you have to take the perspective of this point forward. That is the what we teach people is the optimal decision math. So that's what I would say is you always have to continue to evaluate from your current point forward what's the best outcome and whether or not that's worth it for you to keep investing time in. For me, I usually do it. Pivoting, I think research is always a pivot. You're always trying to revise and edit. That's what I would say.
Thank you for all those insights. The next set of questions are around the topic of diversification, which is kind of related to pivoting. And I'm asking this because there's a lot of advice to diversify funding portfolios, but at least for me, and I've seen in other colleagues that this practice is actually difficult. So my first question related to this is if is this diversification truly feasible for most researchers, or is this just overstated? And related to this, what does effective diversification actually looks like in today's environment?
Going first again, I would say it's specialized and not diversified in terms of your core identity and your core reputation, and your core competence and skill, which, as Chris described, is that sweet spot of intersection between what you're good at, what you care about, what you can get paid for. And so finding that core is the really key thing, and then diversify around that.
Yeah, to me the key issue is there adequate demand, external demand for what we're doing research on? If there's only one organization in the world that cares about what I'm working on, I might want to rethink my research focus. Because that just suggests to me I may not be spending my time on what the world most needs. I do think funders have a lot of their own agendas out there, obviously, but they reflect the market demand. What is society looking for from researchers? And so if you can't find an area where more than one organization is willing to step up and write a check, you either need to think about reframing it or find where your ikigai is, because that might not be it.
Um, Yeah, so I have previously I wanted to relocate from where I currently was to Ohio because I love Ohio. I love the Midwest. And so what my attempt was, to try to actually do some US based work. And the reaction was that that's too different. For me, and my perspective was, oh, I do healthcare in Uganda. I can do healthcare in the US. That, from my experience, is not rewarded at all. Um, it actually had backfired, and I think had the appearance of being kind of a dilettante who's not really serious about anything. So what I would say is people who are hiring you, who are writing you letters, it's distracting and confusing when your research portfolio is extremely diverse. That's not typically what is valued from a sample size of one. Obviously, you see, top people that have a large breadth of portfolio, and that's considered impressive. My experience is that's not the way I was perceived. So, what I would say is, when in doubt, it's better to specialize. On the other hand, you kind of sometimes have to do where the money is, or you have to go where people say yes and where the team opportunity is there to join. So, for example, I've done cost benefit analysis as part of another team because I was asked and it seemed okay. So you can't, it's hard to have, strict rules, but in general, I would say the profession that I've experienced does not value breadth, it values depth.
Awesome. Thank you, Anya. I think this is great advice, which leads me to the next topic on advice that doesn't age well. So my question to you around those lines is, what is the one piece of conventional advice about building an international research career like all of you have done that you think is now outdated or is even counterproductive in these times?
We stay in the same order. I would say, and this is perhaps something that others would not agree with, that research in economics and in development generally, it's not a geography joke that you have to be there to understand. It is true to go places. It's important to go places and walk around and talk to people. That does matter a lot in order, especially to know the views of decision makers and what they care about. But you can learn a lot without being places. And especially as Chris emphasized, the way that our partners I work primarily in African context. And when I first went to, work in Africa, I went as a high school teacher and then a university lecturer and then a research collaborator. And that was, 30 years ago. And now it's just a completely different world where those institutions are vastly stronger. And I would much prefer to be, a sub-awardee to their grants that they lead, not because they actually know their country better, although they do, but because they have the institutional connections and the trust to make the decisions matter. And so the point I would make about advice that doesn't age well is that I think it's no longer true that you have to physically be places to know what's going on there. I think you can add a lot of value by collaborating with local people who do know the context and who do have those connections to provide some aspect of technical toolkit, some aspect of access to international or comparative data, all the points that Chris and Anne were making, where your core expertise complements theirs. And so I just am not entirely sure that it's that necessary. Although it's still so valuable to be places and walk around and talk to people. People used to say that, oh, unless you'd been somewhere, you didn't know what was going on and you couldn't contribute. And I'm not sure that's true. I think people with strong technical skills who have that willingness, as Chris said, to park your ego at the door and help people can be just enormously valuable, even if you've never been somewhere. I hope that's true. I don't know if that's true, if others would agree with that, but it's a change I've seen where I can be, have my work be led by local people and not have to know that much about the context because I can trust them to know.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to partly agree with Will and partly disagree. When I was a PhD student, I was fortunate to get research funding from Fulbright and SSRC to go to Madagascar to do field research. And I still remember SSRC sent around a review team. They were trying to figure out what to do with their current grad student funding programs. And they showed up at the University of Wisconsin and talked to the then director of graduate studies, who will go nameless, who said, "Oh, he's not really one of ours. He goes off to these weird places." And this was reported back to me. And and the advice that I had gotten from senior faculty in the Department of Economics at Wisconsin was, there's plenty of data, just use the data. Don't waste your time doing data collection. Don't waste your time traveling to these places. You'll just get sick. You'll lose time. Time is your most valuable asset. That was terrible advice then. It's terrible advice now. While I don't think one has to collect primary data necessarily, and especially if, as I emphasized earlier, and as Will just said, especially if you're willing to work more in a technical support role, working with local partners who will always understand the context better than you will, the need to travel is sharply reduced. But early career researchers have to be the lead on some research. You cannot just be technical support, at least those who are seeking tenure. You've got to build a research reputation that you are one of the experts on a topic. And if you are always working in support, you just can't do that. So whatever it is you choose to make as your defining signature area of research, you need to go in situ and get to know that place, get to develop an intuition for how should I interpret the data, so that you can, both specification and inference depend upon a deep contextual understanding. If you're supporting others who are leading the research, you can rely on them to do that. But if you're the one leading the research, you better get on an airplane and just spend some time in what Biju Rao, the World Bank economist, often called the chai stall test instead of a chi-square test. Go sit at a chai stall and just listen to people and chat with people for a while and see what you learn.
I don't know if I can think of any advice off the top of my head that's really wrong. I think the only advice that is maybe sometimes questionable is adding more people shares the workload. And I don't know if that's always the case. So, people, when they're struggling with research, because research is hard, want to add and phone a friend and add somebody else to the paper. And there are pros and cons to that. So, there's a proverb that if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go with others. But sometimes when you go with others, you don't go at all. There, things grind to a halt. So I just want to I think that sometimes if you are kind of struggling on a project or getting something together, sometimes you need to be prepared to just do it alone. Because adding more people does not make it go faster or necessarily even improve the quality. That's what I would say. But it can.
It's always a very big task to choose the right collaborators, I guess. So I just want to move now the conversation towards mentorship and the future pipeline. And I have two important questions, and I will just mention one first for you guys. The first one is early career researchers. Early career researchers often feel they must follow the money, like we have mentioned, to secure tenure. I mean, that conversation has been here various times. So how can they build a consistent scholarly identity when the funding landscape feels like a moving target? And I'm asking this for a friend.
I mean, I hope it's pretty clear from what Anne said, what Chris said, but it is helpful to frame it maybe slightly differently in terms of mentorship and career identity, where the key question for me is, who are your people? It gets to this idea that, as a complement to artificial intelligence, you need human intelligence. And by human intelligence, I mean people skills, like just knowing, who are your people? What do they like? What do they want? What do they care about? And learning from them what is valued. So while follow the money, is important, it's also follow the leaders, follow the people. And of course, you don't want to do that in a way that devalues your own unique contribution. The whole point is, who are you as an individual, adding and contributing and being different from the others, but in sync with them. So that's the way I would frame it, is think of the question, is your people, because Anne described an experience of taking a toolkit over to the US domestic research questions, and you probably got the right answer, right? You probably had like really great work, right? But it's on someone else's turf. There might be some things you missed, subtleties that you didn't have as much expertise as you thought, and they weren't your people, right? You hadn't paid your dues in some sense in that community. So my answer to this question of mentorship and pipeline would be focused on a set of individuals who can be your letter writers, who can be your advice givers. I think the term mentor is awfully overused. It's helpful just to think specifically about what can people do concretely, and that includes both advice and letter writing, point out jobs to you, and so forth.
Yeah, I don't really have anything to add to Will's good advice. I completely agree.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add is how important it is to chase the money really does depend upon your personal circumstances. If you're in a soft money job that requires contracts, then I think you have to chase the money, and you have to probably consider, you don't have to do anything you don't want, but you may want to consider doing projects that are a little bit less interesting to you, just so you can keep doing what you want. All jobs have that property. All jobs have things that you don't want to do, and what that looks like looks different for other people. If you're in a job where you're not strictly dependent upon chasing the money, I mean, what I'm just personally doing is trying to be more selective. I keep getting emails about applying for, one government agency or another, and I look at how they're not dispersing awards, and I say, well, I don't think that's a good use of my time right now. Um, and I think the other people have to make calculations, right? So I know people in the hard sciences that they don't have the luxury of waiting, because they're soft money and their lab will close. So I really think it's very personal, and that I'm happy to, keep sharing ideas of where to look for money if you are soft money, but it is helpful to be choosy, I think.
So we have been mentioning about writing the paper, writing the technical reports, navigating the climate by, establishing relationships with the program officers. And Chris mentioned that, one way to do that, the right way is to go to these meetings and talk directly to them, right? I was wondering if you have additional advice or tips for junior scholars to start building those relationships with program officers in a professional way.
It's a great question. I don't. Um, I don't. I have to say I haven't done that myself. And maybe that's a huge failing on my part. Chris, you would have secrets. You're much better at that.
Yeah, a couple of approaches that work, and not all of these options are available to everybody. One is, join in a supporting role, a bigger project that, Will's leading with a foundation or something, and just tag along in Will's meetings with them so that you get to know the program officers, listen to what they have to say. I mean, replace Will with whatever senior person is available to you, works in your space, and seems to be able to access resources. Another is there are lots of places that are routinely looking for reviewers. USDA commonly sends around requests for people to sign up to review NEFA or other proposals. If it's in your space, do it. Yes, it takes time, and time is a precious resource. But one, you learn something from reading other people's proposals, and two, you learn a lot about the process and the program officers, and they learn a fair amount about you in how you think about problems, whether they can rely on you, et cetera. So part of this is just tag along when you get the chance. Part of this is, take the initiative to volunteer to be a reviewer for the organizations that you would like to ultimately fund your own research. And part of it is many of us automatically go to the sessions at conferences where we're going to hear exciting papers by scholars we want to listen to. And that's great. You'll be able to read their paper later, though. So if you have the choice to do that or go listen to several people who are going to be able to give you insights on how grants making is happening in their organization, go to the latter, because their comments are not going to wind up published in a journal anytime soon.
So also, that's great advice. Also, what I would say is sometimes, not always, I agree. Some of these avenues are more accessible to others. Foundations, even the government sector typically have either a scorecard, an explicit scorecard about how your grant is scored, or just internal priorities. Often they're not typically very opaque about this because they want to, well, for the government, they typically want to be kind of clear about what they're looking for and to make a level playing field for foundations. They tend to be somewhat clear as well because they want to restrict the number of applicants that they have and things to review. It is really helpful to, if you can't speak to somebody at that foundation, which is usually kind of difficult in my experience, often you can talk to people who have received those sorts of grants. And there's also an active whisper network just asking around. So I put in my slides, for example, like the agency fund. The agency fund, they have this website. It's a really easy application. So, a friend talked to somebody because she had a connection about who runs that. Their open call has a less than 1% acceptance rate, and they only want things on technology. So that's helpful information because, yeah, it's easy to apply, but the chances are really low. And many other foundations have a similar flavor of that, where they're kind of looking for something specific, right? They're looking for, like for what I know, the new div is looking a lot about scale. They want things that have good cost effectiveness and high propensity to scale. And I can't tell you that necessarily for every single funder, but FID, they very explicitly say in the RFP they prioritize certain countries. That seems to be true if you look at what they are currently funding. So I think somehow using whatever networks you have, either institutional or friends, or asking people who have received those grants, just stalking people a bit, is a good use of resources and time, especially if you don't have a lot of experience in that particular funder.
Thank you. And before we go to the Q&A section of this seminar, I'd like to ask one last question around where the field is headed. So for all of you, my question is, looking at the next 3 to 5 years, so like kind of medium term, what is the one emerging area of international development or a specific funder, if you want to see it that way, that you believe that the AAEA community is currently underutilizing?
So I want to say three things. First, in terms of a specific set of collaborators, I would say it's probably private sector partners in the developing world that, along with the explosive improvements and growth in our academic and research partners, especially the people I know in Africa, there's also this explosive growth in the firms. And the firms in agriculture, the processing, distribution, input supply companies, are increasingly using data analytics tools themselves. So I would think that partnerships with firms is one potential growth area. The two other things I want to say about evolution of the field are the following. First of all, in the 2010s and over the previous decades, we as academics built up a lot of abstract concepts and ideals that have now lost their connection to funding and policy relevance. So we, I think, have a huge task to rebuild our research programs around concrete, specific things for people, and in particular for economic growth and development that's inclusive and general that everyone can benefit from, in contrast to distributional concerns. So this idea of trying to make your work as concrete as possible, specific material, sort of every time you use the word systemic, just backspace, 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 because that's a seminar word that's relevant for theory, but not relevant. It's not an actual thing, right? It's an important theoretical construct, but it's not the actual thing. And then ask if that's something that, a random person on the street would say, yes, that could potentially benefit me, and not a narrow parochial interest in a subgroup. So I hope that's, something that we can use to rebuild trust in science, because we're talking about actual things and not something you have to have gone to grad school to understand, and rebuild support for science because everybody can benefit from it, not just a narrow subgroup.
Yeah, I would echo Will's emphasis on the private sector funds a lot more research than the public and philanthropic sectors combined already, and that trend is only going to grow. You just have to be a little careful about disclosures and whether you truly have control over data and there's an authentic interest in coming up with the true answer to the question, not the answer that their marketing department wants. And this comes back to the point about relationships. If you've built a relationship as an honest broker and you're transparent and upfront with them in the initial discussions, you can figure out whether they are genuinely open to good research. There are a lot of pre-competitive questions. One of the things that I think we have not done a good job of as a profession is in establishing consortia of organizations that all share an interest in understanding the answers to the same things, because that is just part of their pre-competitive space in their industry. Before I went back to do a PhD, I worked in that space for commercial lenders around the world. In the 1980s, they were grappling with prospective defaults from large sovereign borrowers, Brazil, Argentina, Mexico, virtually every country in Africa. And they all needed background economic research. So I was part of a group, the Institute of International Finance, that did that research on behalf of all the lenders. Then they compete with each other over who would lead a syndicated lending operation and who would be the underwriter of a new bond issue, et cetera. But they all worked from a common core. We can do that sort of thing, but we haven't organized effectively as a profession to do it. And part of that is we have not invested well enough in building some of the relationships with industry that are necessary to underpin that. But we have the capacity to do that in part because of the land grant traditions and the CGIR parallel tradition of bridging between research and outreach and impact, and our ability to work with natural scientists that, frankly, most of the economics departments just don't have. So if we can put together teams across institutions, across disciplines that can address the pre-competitive questions that industries face, I think we have the potential to raise significant money and answer important questions that benefit everybody involved.
Yeah, those are great points. I think what I would say is the future is AI. So the I'm not sure how familiar the audience is with AI. Maybe you've ChatGPT in the web portal. That's not nearly as powerful as it can be. I'm still learning it myself, but a colleague of mine who was using Claude with the API and buying tokens compared it to the discovery of the internet or the creation of the internet. And I think that there's competing ways to understand how that's going to affect the profession at large. On the one hand, somebody who is at a smaller university said she feels like it's actually leveling the playing field. She doesn't have an RA to do her analysis for her. And now she has Claude, which can actually go in and prepare tables. She can check the code, but she can write pretty impressive reports and analysis pretty quickly. The flip side of that, of course, is for younger people if it's going to replace jobs. And I'm concerned about that kind of as a societal level. And I don't know how to balance those two, but I do think what is very uncertain right now is how AI is going to affect publishing, the creation of LLM generated papers, the detection of research errors in publication, the eroding stigma of using AI at all, and how that interacts with the dawn also of increasing administrative data. So there's the new funding model at a global scale has been government to government agreements, and part of those agreements, from what I understand, are data sharing agreements. So there's going to be massive flows and institutionalizing of administrative data, which should be a high quality, that somebody is going to have to analyze. And I don't think we're going to just outsource all that to AI. Of course, some of it will be, but it's going to need pretty advanced tools. And I think most people here are pretty aware of that and know how to analyze data very well. But just kind of tooling up and having sort of the ability to uh, be on the cutting edge of machine learning and regression and coming up with research designs based upon existing opportunities is going to be really maybe exciting is the wrong word. um, Interesting. I'll just end with that.
Thank you, Ann, Chris, and Will. And I think we have a couple minutes for probably one or two questions from the audience. So if you have any questions for the speakers, feel free to unmute yourself and ask them directly. Let's see if anybody has a question. I don't see anybody unmuting themselves, so that's completely okay. Okay, well, Barrett Kramer, please go ahead.
All right, thanks so much. This was all really interesting. I was wondering for the panelists how you see sort of the gap in data that we see, at least in administrative data, in a lot of countries, for instance, in Africa or Asia. If you are concerned that with the rise of AI, that this might actually sort of reduce our ability to learn about how systems, sorry, Will, that I'm using the term, but how things there work. Just because the AI that we're producing is just as good as the data that goes into it. And if there's no data to train the AI, and if we're working in very data scarce environments, and data collection is costly, and that's driving up the cost of doing research, maybe sort of, a lot more people are being pushed to not working on development, and we learn a lot less about what's needed to help countries develop. So what's your thinking on that, and how to potentially, counterbalance that and still make sure that we do generate high quality data in these types of environments?
It's a great question. We might hear from Leah first and then respond to both together.
I wouldn't have asked this question. I'll just ask it but nobody was asking one, and it was in the back of my mind through multiple of your comments. I was just wondering if you have time as you working into the other question. No worries if not. Can you speak at all to the role of teams in adjusting, like, either teams for new skills, teams for, better grant writing, like just how you see the role of teams in this moment, maybe changing, or maybe just as important as they always were, and then the sort of the composition of teams and how to put them together well.
Wow, really interesting. So Berber's point about AI, the way I describe AI is giving you the average of the internet plus randomness. So, in the context window, you're going to tell it what you mean by the internet, right? You're going to say, give me a mashup of Shakespearean sonnets and NBA basketball, whatever the thing is. And it's going to go to the average, and it's going to give you some randomness. So it's going to be good for creativity. It's going to be good for, because of the randomness, and it's going to be good for retrieval. So the question is, like, what can you do to use it well and to be a complement to it? And I totally agree with Anne. I hope it was clear from my very quick mention of it, that you want to tool up as fast as you can, right? So that means pay the $20 a month for a few months so that you get to experience it and take the time to use it to see how it can speed up your workflow. During the period of great abundance, relative abundance, in the 2010s, we trended to treat academia as something where fairness was the most important thing, right? Where we were trying to make it a level playing field and have it be really fair, but we kind of lost track of our mission, which is to discover true things and make them relevant. And other people, their stake in what we do, they destroyed things. They destroyed people's lives because we weren't helping them enough. And so unless we get back on the horse of delivering something that people really care about. So my point is simply, to Berber's point, you would spend your time trying to add value to the average of the internet plus randomness, add value to what the AI is having to offer. And that could be done by proximity to decision makers. In the chat, I wrote about examples of where we have UK government funding, and the thing that they care about is the researcher regularly meeting with government officials? That's it. Is there a pipeline of conversation where the budget is spent on placements and engagements that ensure that the research is done in dialogue with, literal dialogue with the decision maker in a action-oriented government agency, a line ministry, or other organization that is responsible for dispersal of public funds, where you can demonstrably show that the research will inform what is spent or the regulatory and policy rules of the road. So the point is, AI is a tool. We need to use it as fast and as well as we possibly can to achieve the goal of delivering research results that can inform decisions. And if the thing that you have, Berber, is, and this gets also to Leah's point about teams, is that you are living in a capital city in Africa, the question is, can you find a way to have your time be spent guiding the research to the relevant questions through actual contact with decision makers, in contrast to just within the research community?
We're at time, but I'll just briefly to answer Leah's question. I mean, I was a military officer. I played team sports. I believe in teams as being extraordinarily effective for people who are inclined to play team sports or work as parts of units. And there are a lot of academics, a lot of researchers who really are not hardwired to work in teams. So don't try to force it if you aren't a team-oriented person. That's perfectly fine. But it does change the nature of the questions you can ask. If you want to deal with big, complicated problems, teams are typically the right way to go, but you have to put together a team that has the right personalities of other team players and recognize that coordination costs increase exponentially with the size of the team. So you need people who can handle the coordination. But you crowd in an awful lot of talent and complementary skills when you can do that. It's not a necessary condition. For some of us, it's a very rewarding attribute of a research design.
So what I would say to Berber is I think compared to the size of the population in low-income contexts, there is already an extreme scarcity of data. I mean, that's why many of us collect primary data, is because the data that we need doesn't exist, and the administrative data sources that do exist are not terribly reliable. I think for AI to really be meaningful for development research, that would need to be addressed somehow. I know, for example, like HMIS in health, the health context is known to be effective. On the other hand, or high quality. On the other hand, I have educational data sets where this, our starting assumption is that there was massive cheating during the test. And so we have to do our own tests, and that's borne out in the data. So I think before AI, especially with the development research, is going to take place, there would need to be some safeguards so that it actually has meaning. But that being said, I do think that we are moving towards that path. The other thing is, I do think that this could be an opportunity. This new frontier we're about to envision, not just with AI, but also with funding, there could be great opportunities to, for example, create new data sets like the DHS that are high quality, that are implemented by bureaus of statistics in different countries, so that we all don't have to go into schools and ask principals the same sets of questions. There seems to be some lack of coordination that could make respondents' lives better, that could make a more equitable playing field if some data collection was not done by individual people, but rather institutionalized. And the last thing I'd say about to Leah is, somebody told me that to start a project takes enthusiasm and to finish it takes discipline. And I think that that good teams need all types of people. And just shout out because Leah is actually really good to work with.
Many, many thanks. And so, on behalf of the AAEA International Section, I want to thank all our panelists, Chris and Will, for your thoughtful, candid, and constructive reflections. I also want to thank again everyone who participated and contributed questions. We're really grateful for all the engagement. And again, I want to thank you, the AAEA Trust, for supporting this event. And we hope this discussion continues beyond today's session. And yeah, thank you all and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you all. See you in Kansas City.